Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Talking About Coaching. Today, we're going to be talking about silence, and I'm aware of the inherent paradox in it. I think it's worth talking about. I think it's almost worth more not talking, but we'll give it a bit of context. So the question that I often get from coaches, or maybe not often, but certainly every now and then is, what was it formulated as? Yeah, how do I work with silence? Is that still coaching? It freaks my clients out. So I think each of these three kind of parts of the questions are very worth discussing. You know, how do I work with silence? Is that still coaching when I'm not saying something and when my client is not saying something? And it freaks my clients out because silence can be something quite uncomfortable to sit in. So I'll throw that out there and let's talk about it.
Yeah, certainly. I think learning to work with silence has definitely been one of the most kind of powerful aspects of my learning curve as a coach. It was something we discussed particularly in our module back when I was training. And it was definitely one of the hardest things to get comfortable with myself. I think it's like an intuition to want to support and like perhaps a pressure we put on ourselves as coaches to try and find the next relevant and good and powerful question. But actually, as I started experimenting a bit more with silence and being comfortable with it myself, I found the results with clients really, really powerful. And perhaps it is that very discomfort that has the potential to draw out, interesting responses and new reactions or new knowledge about your client. That's my intuitive kind of, first thought.
Yeah, for me, it came from an experience from, my previous coach, hiring a coach that created a lot of silence in the sessions. Sometimes I would ask him, are you still there? Right? We wouldn't have video calls, just calls. And often there was a long silence. And it was very uncomfortable at the beginning, but it created a lot of space, right, for insights. And I think that's a powerful thing about silence is often as coaches, if we just slow down and we don't just answer a question, the client often will come up with something, right? And it's just that extra 10 seconds or 20 seconds of breathing, creating that space. And I love this example by Michael Neal. He talks about a lamppost metaphor. He says, look, if a man would go to a lamppost and would just go there every night and talk about his problems, talk about his day, talk about what happened in the day, his challenges, he would get a lot of benefit from that. And the lamppost doesn't talk back, right? But it's there, right? And I think that's really useful. And as coaches, we can take a lot from that. Sometimes I think.
Did you say Michael Neal? Because I read that
Michael Neal.
I read that in Rich Litvin's book, and I thought
too,
it was. I was accredited to him.
It's a concept described in the Prosperous Coach, but it comes from Michael Neal.
Cool.
Oh, interesting.
Right. And often as coaches we think like, am I giving enough value? Am I providing enough value? Well, even if you would just be like a lamppost, you would actually create a lot of value for people.
And I tell coaches that a lot. If you just show up and you create a space for somebody to talk and to think, you're creating a lot of value. And often you create more value when you don't speak and you allow your client to make the connections and to grapple with, whatever is present for them, than when you guide them or when you ask them questions or, when you insert some sort of influence. But there was also something in there earlier that I kind of wanted to point out, because I think there is silence that is particularly useful, and there is silence that is just to do, what are you doing? Can you please say something? Like that's not productive, and it's difficult when you're on the phone with somebody. It's easier to grasp when you're sitting with somebody or you see them, because you can see whether this is a useful silence where somebody has a space to keep thinking about something, or whether this is the kind of silence where they really just need you to say something, and it's they're not thinking about anything other than, why the fuck is this guy not speaking? So however, that said, I think the clients can learn that this is the way you work. you know, if you contracted it at the beginning, you know, sometimes there will be silences, and this is how I use them and this is how I value them. So you will often find me not immediately responding to something that you've said, you know, because I believe in providing that kind of space. I believe a lot of value comes out of that space of silence, you know, when you take the lead. So you'll find me doing that. And in the beginning, it might be awkward. And you will have those moments where the client is like, well, why aren't you saying something? And, you know, they want some kind of guidance from somebody else. So if they learn that you work with silence, or you've talked about that in the beginning, then that value will emerge, you know, with time. People get used to using the coaching space.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things that come up for me after what you've just said there. What it made me think is like, you know, one way of getting around this idea of silence maybe not being productive is kind of to let go of it, thinking of it as a kind of an emptiness or a lack, and kind of reframe it as like silence as a tool, right? It's just another tool I can draw on, and with certain clients or in certain situations, that's a good tool to, you know, put to the test. The other kind of silence I think I want to differentiate with then is kind of more, you know, the silence of the coach. And I think that's in response to what you're saying about kind of non-productive silence. But I guess what I'm questioning is, you know, silence as a coach is still kind of allowing yourself the space to be present and kind of have a sense of emergence and immediacy in your interaction with the client, rather than having these pre-formulated questions or thinking about questions in your discussion. So I think, you know, there's a silence the coach can create for themselves to create a moment or a space to think and let the question arise. And then there's a silence you can use as a tool with your client, almost in the same way, to let something new arise.
Yeah, and I think that question around, is that still coaching, is an interesting one, because if we use silence as part of the coaching, very much still coaching. If somebody never says anything and just like literally does the lamppost, I don't think that's coaching. You know, I think the client would get a lot of value from talking to the lamppost person or the actual lamppost. But I don't think that's coaching. I don't think a lamppost can coach you, because for me, coaching, there's something around a conversation about what you want to get out of this and where do you go, and particularly a human to human relationship. And if one of the people in the relationship never says anything, you know, then there's a disconnect, I think. It doesn't mean that there's not value in that, but I don't think that's coaching anymore. But if the silence is placed within the coaching framework, it's super, super powerful.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with that. I think it has to be purposeful, right? If we just insert it because, you know, we know it's others do it, then it's not that intentful. But what I've noticed is, especially working with high achievers, is, you know, often they speed up, their thinking is fast, and by just creating that silence, it helps them slow down, right? And then sometimes all we have to do is just, you know, ask a question like, hey, well, before I give you, you know, before we kind of dive in deeper, tell me a bit more about that. And then just really slowing down. And I've noticed that is, you know, especially for people that, you know, high performers that go very fast. We live in a fast-paced world as well, right? In that space where we're holding that space, we know what we're doing, right? So there's a distinction there, right? Between completely saying nothing for the sake of it, or actually trying to draw out maybe a distinction, trying to draw out an insight from a client and helping them slow down.
I really like oh, sorry, Yannick.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, Faye was saying, behind the silence to our clients, establish the truth behind the silence to our clients is essential to avoid confusion in his end.
Nice.
Establishing the truth behind the silence. As I understand it, like the way I make sense of that is that out of truth comes something from the client. You know, if we don't interfere with the process of them making sense of something, we can be much more sure that this is something that is the client's truth. This is something that emerged from the client. So I think within coaching, there's always this interplay between how much influence do I insert here? How much of myself do I bring into this? because I want my clients to find their own solutions and their own answers, and to, produce their own way forward and navigate life and take full responsibility for it. But I also want to insert some positive influence in there, facilitate. But as soon as we are in interaction, we are inserting some influence. We're bringing ourselves into our clients' lives. And by definition, we take responsibility there. So it's an interesting interplay between, letting our clients do their thing and facilitating their journey so that they feel empowered, and us bringing ourselves in and our value to support them and help them.
I really like that. And I also really liked what Sivash said in the connection he made with silence and slowing things down again. And I think it's just something I'm thinking a lot about at the moment. It's kind of the notion of presence in coaching, and like almost like more mindfulness coaching and that kind of thing. Slowing down and the silence, I think the response you get, and I think, that's the power of silence, is kind of the emergence of something new. And whilst it can be uncomfortable, I think that's where the influence as a coach comes in, right? Our duty as a coach is to some extent to push our clients out of their comfort zone. So I think, it's like you're killing two birds with one stone, because, you're allowing for their discomfort. And as a coach, you're challenging them in that sense. You're allowing something new to arise out of that. But you're also kind of bringing them into a state that maybe, like you were saying, high achievers, that they're not that familiar with, by slowing them down and creating that emptiness, which is kind of that presence where something can emerge. So I think, it's an amazing tool in so many ways.
Yeah. And we see this in other industries as well, right? There's a great documentary on Netflix about Michael Jordan. And one of the things he said when Phil Jackson became the coach, and he's the coach that turned everything around, helped him play more as a team. But one of the things he introduced is mindfulness, and he created a space, and it was just really that silence, right? And he asked the whole team to just be in that space for 5-10 minutes, and it helped them perform better when the pressure was really high, right? Because he said we weren't reacting as much. We were able to respond better. We were able to just, we were able to practice that muscle. So they were practicing that muscle in training, and then in the game, it helped them to slow down and actually make better decisions.
Yeah, but this is also where the last part of this question creeps in, because when I sit in silence, most of the time, it's that, I'm sitting there, I'm being mindful, I'm feeling really present and grounded, and it really helps me a lot. Sometimes when I sit in silence, something comes up that is quite uncomfortable, something that maybe I hadn't paid attention to because I was quite distracted or too busy in life, something that is perhaps something I have done and I regret, or something that I need to get done and I've been trying to avoid, things that I might have suppressed, and all of a sudden that feeling creeps back up. So I think that's why silence freaks some people out, as the question was worded. I think that's where mindfulness sometimes gets a bad rep, because when you sit with yourself and there's something with yourself that is important but uncomfortable, that you've been avoiding or suppressing or whatever, it comes up in moments of silence. And for coaching, that's fantastic, because then we can actually deal with it. If you get uncomfortable, if your client gets uncomfortable in a moment of silence, I'm really curious about that. And that's the value of silence. It brings stuff out, not necessarily comfortable, but certainly super valuable and meaningful, and you can still decide that you're not going to deal with this now, and you're going to park it for later. But I think it's important to kind of open our eyes to what's present with us. And in silence, it has an opportunity to come up, regardless whether that's comfortable or not. It allows us a choice, whether we're going to deal with it or not.
I mean, in the words of Simon and Garfunkel, it just made me think it's like the sound of silence, right? Like, even though it's silence, it's so potent. And the other thing, I was having a discussion with my partner recently, who's currently doing a course in psychotherapy. And she informed me, there's I think there's a branch of therapy of some sorts, or there was an example of someone whose therapist literally was just silent the whole time. And he was like, oh my God, I'm walking to therapy and I'm just paying you to be silent. But like, their method was just pure silence, I think for like 10 sessions. I think the one thing that's interesting is perhaps about contracting. It sounds like in this example, the person wasn't aware when they entered their relationship with that therapist that was their method of therapy. So they were just really taken aback and a bit surprised, and perhaps didn't have the experience that signed themselves up for. So again, and we touched upon this at the beginning of our conversation here, is like, if you're someone who perhaps as a coach really uses silence in like a very direct, and like that's your method, perhaps that's something worth, mentioning in your contracting with a client. So
yeah, I've heard that a few times, that, my therapist didn't say anything. Maybe 10 sessions is extreme perhaps, but I think that contracting makes all the difference. Imagine you go to a Vipassana retreat and you think it's like a normal retreat.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, like, nobody speaks and you don't know what the fuck, and you're talking and like nobody answers. It's like, that would be weird. But it would be weird at a Vipassana retreat if somebody is trying to make everybody talk. But I think the contracting bit is quite important, And like, it doesn't just freak the clients out. I think sometimes when we might say, and this may or may not be the case here, but if you say it freaks my clients out, I think very often the coach is freaked out, by what's happening in that silence. And it can be a tough place to hold that silence and to resist the urge of stepping in to rescue a client from the discomfort that has just emerged. It's a natural urge to say, oh, you're feeling uncomfortable. Just acknowledge it, and invite them to sit with it. Invite yourself to sit with it for a little while. Yes, it's valuable perhaps to say like, oh, what's the discomfort? Tell me about, what's the sensation? How does it feel? What's that about? And then you can work with it. It's a fair approach. But, sometimes to just sit in the discomfort and see what emerges from it can be equally or perhaps even more powerful.
Yeah.
And also, just to give another perspective, right? For the first year or two of my coaching, I hardly use silence. And I had this real idea that, well, the more I bring in, the more I say, the more value I create. Right? And I think that's, as coaches, often we equal silent as, not being valuable. And I think it's really to understand, well, it can be a valuable tool, but again, it comes with practice. And often what I've found personally is by doing really the inner work, it's easier to hold the silence. By having a practice outside of the sessions where you can hold the space for yourself. Right. And, and another interesting thing is, right, silent is the same way spelled as listen, right? And often is correlated with each other, right? As coaches, we're often, especially if coaches are just qualified, if they're a bit inexperienced, it's very easy to, jump in and say, well, I know where this is going, or we're listening and agreeing, or we're listening already and negating, rather than just being really present and listening.
My God, I had to double check that. It's true. Silent is an anagram for listen. That is so cool.
That is cool. Absolutely.
There was a recent episode of, oh my God, what's the, damn it. There's a Netflix show. It's animated by the makers of Adventure Time and Duncan Trussell. Come on.
It says nothing.
Sorry, I don't know it.
I have to put it in the show notes. It's amazing. It's basically this, they've taken parts of Duncan Trussell's podcast and then the Adventure Time animator, like they put a whole thing together. And it's weird because you can listen to it and it gives you lots of value, and you can look at it just without the audio and it makes sense because there's a story. But then somehow there's a story that unfolds and crazy stuff is happening all the time. But at the same time, there's these two people talking about really deep stuff, meditation, magic, like birth, but listening. There was an episode on listening, and they compared listening to breathing. It's important to breathe in, and that's the listening part. If you're always breathing out, it's really, really exhausting. So we actually need some balance around, listening and speaking. And I just found that such a beautiful metaphor.
Really cool. Just what you were saying now, it just reminded me a bit of like, I suddenly went back to think about silent movies back in the day. And, that made me think, as a coach also in silence, we forget that there's a whole thing of body language, which is another component of kind of my course of, how powerfully that communicates. So when we're in a space of silence, it's perhaps even really conducive for us as coaches to have the opportunity to really observe how our client interacts with that and read their body language in a more direct kind of way. In fact, I don't know if this is an exercise you guys have done. Again, I did on my training. and it was about silence. And I just remember it was my favorite exercise, and I found it so amazingly powerful. And what we had to do is in partners, one person who was the coach had to put in headphones with music really, really loud so they couldn't hear what their client was saying. So, and then the client would spend 3 or 5 minutes kind of describing something they wanted to bring into coaching. And at the end of that, the coach unplugged and you kind of discussed, okay, this is what I got from your body language once you heard nothing. And it was incredible how accurately, once you kind of focused and zoned in on that as your only kind of medium for communication, how accurately you could gauge emotions and like the fluctuation that happened throughout the conversation. So for me, that completely cemented and sold silence for me as a really amazing tool.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much communicated when your client is not speaking. So it doesn't mean that they're silent, you know, it just means they're not speaking, that they're certainly still communicating. The Midnight Gospel, by the way, look it up. It's
cool.
crazy interesting.
Nice.
But yeah, it's a learned skill. What you're saying, just like it's important, I think, for a lot of people to know that you can learn to sit comfortably in silence. I'm now very comfortable in like workshop settings or, you know, in meetings or in conversations when nobody's speaking. You know, I'm just being in the space, even if like it doesn't really matter. I'm okay now sitting in the silence. And it used to also freak me out. It used to make me feel quite uncomfortable because I'm like, oh, somebody should speak. Like we should be knowing where to go next and what question to ask next. So it's certainly a journey, and we can practice. You know, set yourself some exercises like the one you just described, or perhaps to just, you know, get together with one of your coaching buddies, you know, can be a colleague or somebody you're training with currently, or just a friend and say, hey, I want to, you know, sit more comfortably in silence. Do you want to practice that with me? Can we just like sit here and like look at each other? That's one of the most powerful exercises that I've done in with my students is to just a minute, just look each other in the eye and not say anything.
That's
you know,
beautiful.
and you have like 60 people in the room and they're just looking at each other. And it's so difficult for many not to speak, not to communicate, not to make noises or not to smile at each other or like, you know, just to be there. It's so difficult. And then after the minute is over, it feels like half an hour and everybody's so yeah, I can recommend practicing it.
That's awesome. I was going to say, you know, one obvious one for you as a coach, as an individual, you can do on your own is just meditation. That's so helpful to kind of get comfortable with silence and also become more aware of what happens for you in that, so that you don't then end up, you know, putting that onto your client.
It's a bit different though in meditation because you're there to be silent, you know, even if it's with other people, like it's contracted that nobody is supposed to speak. It's much harder if the other person may want you to say something. And
but I guess it's getting
not
comfortable with your own silence, right? So it's like not leaping into the question with your client. And that's an exercise you can do on your own. You don't need anyone else for it. Or
good
if you're
first step.
Yeah, if you're feeling extreme, go Vipassana.
Yeah, I recently, around a month or 2 months ago, I started working with Rich in a group program. And he starts every session with silence.
Nice.
And it's maybe not just silence. He will ask us to close our eyes and breathe in, breathe out for 5 times, and it really helps to just really ground and get present, and then the session starts. And I think for me that made such a shift. And it's not something that she shared initially, but by just the doing, I got more open for it, and I'm using it more and more in my own sessions, just as an experiment. But it's nice. We can sometimes use it at the beginning, sometimes in the, you know, whenever it's suitable throughout the session, and sometimes at the end to wrap up the session. And I found it personally also very useful in the involvement conversation. And I know the question is not, you know, really about involvement, but also, you know, when we talk about, you know, our offer, or we talk about working together with a prospect, just creating space there. What I've found is that because I create a space there, I don't really get this, oh, let me think about it, because I give them the thinking space right there and then. And, you know, I had one of the last prospects that enrolled with me. It took around 3-4 minutes, right? 3-4 minutes after I shared the packages with her. And you know, that thinking space, I think, made the difference, because otherwise it would be, well, you know what, you know, it's a lot to take in. Let me come back to you. right? And it's just that's so powerful to help to give people that space right there and then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a minute of silence with Rich, that's an expensive silence.
Yeah.
But yeah, it goes to show how powerful it is, and I have a few coaches who build that kind of, I wouldn't call that, it is silence, but it's not the kind of silence that I was thinking about coming into the question with, because it's like a created space that's contracted to be silent. But I think, unless any of you have something still you wanted to add, I think it's a good place to kind of bring it down to a close.
Maybe for anyone that's looking to improve their practice. I mean, we gave us some tips already around having a practice, but there's a great book by Nancy Klein, More Time to Think.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Did you say More Time to Think?
Yeah, so she has a book, Time to Think.
Yeah.
I think More Time to Think is for coaches and practitioners.
Nice.
She gives it. And she has plenty of examples of how she uses that.
Plus, she's a wonderful human being. I recently had the honor of conversing with her a bit, and she's just wonderful, always expressing gratitude and like such a warm, nice-spirited human being. If you ever get a chance to be in her presence, I recommend it.
Nice. Sorry, guys, there is actually just one more thing that I wanted to add that just came to my mind, and in case it's useful for others. And that was kind of, and it's building on kind of the body language thing, but it's the opportunity as a coach to also use silence a little bit as a tool for kind of mirroring and pacing. And almost, I want to mean in response to perhaps someone who, again, might be a type A or like a high performer and who's really fast in their thinking and agitated. I know that one theory is it's helpful to match the pace of the clients so as to build kind of trust and empathy. On the other hand, if as a coach you're sensing like, hey, this person might actually, again, benefit from slowing down, it's using yourself as kind of a contrasting kind of person by you responding more slowly and calmly. You're kind of allowing them to kind of perhaps mirror you in response and like enable a different kind of thinking. So again, as a pacing tool, silence, so versatile, so powerful.
Yeah, that is super interesting how we respond to people. And there might be a whole thing around, I would love to have a whole episode around pacing and leading and how that can be. Because we can contrast somebody and just really create that silence from the get-go, whether that's contracted or not, and then maybe they go with it. Or we can start to match them first. And then we slow down. And if we have good rapport, then they will slow down with us. It's kind of, it's in a way it's somewhat manipulating. That's why I always have a bit of a struggle with NLP techniques, but it's manipulating for a really good cause. You kind of create something and then you roll together, but they wouldn't have slowed down if I wouldn't have slowed down. And kind of, I don't know, I have a bit of a quarrel with that always, but I know it works really well. And I know it's really valuable. So I think it depends on how we contract it. But yeah, I think maybe that's a topic for another day.
I'm well up for that. Great.
Yeah, let's add it to the list.
Sweet.
Cool. Thank you, guys. That was really illuminating. I said let's leave it here and let's see you next time. If you have a question, do send it to us. You know where to go by this time. Cheers. Hey everybody. If you found this conversation helpful for you and your coaching practice, then there's a couple of ways that you can support the podcast and stay up to date with future episodes. Obviously, you can subscribe here on YouTube if that's your jam. If you want to get it straight into your inbox, never miss an episode, there's a link in the description to can sign up for our mailing list. You can leave us a review or follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and come join us on Facebook. We'll get the conversation going there. Obviously, leave us a comment. You can support us on Patreon. And any way you choose to do that, tell a friend, whatever you want to do. We really appreciate it, and we hope you get a lot out of it. So, see you next time.